Who holds the keys to the clean energy age? Why does your phone depend on a salt flat in Chile and a rainforest in Indonesia? How far will the United States and China go to control the rocks that power batteries, chips, and missiles? And at what cost to the people who live above those rocks? Electric cars soared past 17 million sales in 2024. That was more than 1 in 5 cars sold worldwide. China alone bought over 11 million. This surge is why lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite and rare earths now sit at the center of power politics and boardroom risk. The scale is new. The scramble is not. What is new is the speed and the concentration. In 2024, the top 3 refining nations held 86% of supply for key energy minerals. Recent growth came from one dominant supplier in each chain: Indonesia for nickel, China for cobalt, graphite and rare earths. That is leverage. And everyone knows it. Control of midstream refining now shapes the US-China contest more than new mine permits do. Washington has tied its $7,500 EV tax credit to where battery minerals and components come from. From 2024, no battery component may come from a foreign entity of concern. From 2025, the same ban hits critical minerals. The rule splits the credit in two: half for minerals, half for components. It rewires automotive supply chains on a tight clock and raises costs if firms cannot reroute in time. Brussels has its own answer. The EU Critical Raw Materials Act sets 2030 goals: mine 10% of what the bloc uses, process 40% at home, and recycle 25%, while capping any single foreign source at 65% at each stage. The targets push capital into European projects that would not clear a hurdle rate on price alone. They are a political premium on resilience. Beijing is not passive. China now requires export permits for key graphite products, the anode backbone of most EV batteries. It has also tightened controls on other strategic materials in response to US tech curbs. When one country processes over 90% of the world's graphite and dominates rare earths and cobalt refining, an export license is not a paper exercise. It is policy power. Resource-rich nations see a once-in-a-century opening. Indonesia banned nickel ore exports in 2020 and built a vast downstream complex. By 2023, it produced more than half of the world's mined nickel and began shipping LME-grade refined metal. This shifted the global cost curve and forced closures elsewhere. But coal-fired power feeds many smelters. Independent studies put emissions intensity for several routes in the 30 to 70 TCO2 per ton of nickel range, far above the cleanest hydropower-based routes. Cheap metal now can mean dear climate later. The Democratic Republic of the Congo still anchors cobalt. In 2024, it supplied roughly 76% of mined output as new projects ramped. Oversupply then crushed prices, hurting local revenues and throwing artisanal miners into deeper precarity. A silver lining is formalization. Industry data indicate artisanal cobalt's market share fell to under 2% in 2024, though watchdogs warn that abuses persist in informal hubs. Price cycles do not erase governance risks. They move them. The hidden costs on land and water are real. In Chile's Salar de Atacama, peer-reviewed work and satellite studies link brine extraction to subsidence of about 1 to 2 centimeters per year in parts of the salt flat, while scientists still debate how to classify brine in water accounting. Communities report stress on fragile ecosystems and demand stricter limits or a shift to direct lithium extraction. The country's lithium strategy now ties production uplifts to tougher social and environmental tests. Growth is not free. It must be earned. There is also a human ledger. Indonesia's nickel boom has delivered jobs and export revenue, but it has also seen deadly smelter accidents and landslides in overloaded industrial parks. Safety standards lagged the speed of construction. Families paid the price. Supply security cannot rest on unsafe shifts. Investors who ignore this face headline risk and stoppages that wipe out any margin from low-cost feed. Markets add their own twists. After a 2022 price spike, 2023 brought a broad fall across lithium, nickel, cobalt and graphite as supply surged. Cheaper inputs helped EV makers, yet the IEA warns that a sustained supply shock could still lift battery pack prices by 40 to 50%. Volatility at the mine gate becomes sticker shock in the showroom. That is why firms now value long offtakes, dual sourcing, and local recycling even when spot prices look kind. Counter-arguments deserve fair weight. Some say the talk of scarcity is overdone because new mines, chemistry shifts, and recycling will solve it. Parts of that are true. LFP batteries have cut cobalt and nickel needs in many segments. Global recycling is scaling and could cover meaningful shares of lithium, nickel and cobalt demand by the 2030s and 2040s, especially in the EU under its battery regulation. But the scrap pool is young. Most EVs sold since 2020 will not return to recyclers for years. Mining still has to fill the gap this decade. The clock, again, is the problem. So what actually decides who wins this race? Not ore grades alone. The edge comes from midstream control, smart trade rules with allies, and the social license to operate. It comes from power that is clean and cheap at the plant fence, not just a concession on a map. It comes from patient capital that can ride the down cycle without cutting corners. And it comes from policy that sees the whole chain, not just the flag at the pit. When does this new map lock in? Many lines are already drawn. US, foreign entity of concern, rules hit minerals from the 1st of January 2025. EU targets fix a 2030 horizon and funding is lining up. China's export licensing for graphite has been in force since December 2023. Indonesia's downstream bet is now the market benchmark for nickel costs. The next 2 to 3 years will decide who bends supply chains and who adapts to them. At what cost does all this move? The cost is water under stress in the desert and coal smoke over smelters in Sulawesi. It is families in cobalt towns who feel price busts first and safety gaps worst. It is also taxpayers underwriting resilience premia in the US and EU to avoid single-point failures later. The alternative, do nothing and hope, costs more when a shock hits. Let's answer the questions we started with. Who holds the keys? Those who master refining and processing with allies, not just mining alone. Why does your phone depend on far-flung places? Because energy-dense materials are geographically lopsided and industrial policy has concentrated the midstream. How far will big powers go? Far enough to tie consumer subsidies to supply chain rules, pass sweeping raw materials laws, and use export controls as bargaining chips. At what cost? Real environmental damage where governance is weak, human harm when safety lags growth, and higher prices when shocks hit fragile chains. The better route is clear: diversify, decarbonize the midstream, enforce labor and water standards, and build recycling that actually bites into demand. That is how we make the green transition fair and durable. If you found this breakdown useful, this channel digs into the numbers behind big geopolitical stories every week. Subscribe, share, and tell me what you want unpacked next. Who really wins this race? Can a green future run on dirty mines? Will Washington or Beijing set the rules? When do resource-rich nations finally cash in? And at what cost to people and places that dig the ore? This story begins with need. The clean tech boom eats metals. Demand for lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, copper and rare earths keeps climbing. Prices crashed in 2023, but that dip hides the core truth. The world still needs far more minerals to hit climate goals. Oversupply today does not erase tightness tomorrow. That mismatch drives politics as much as markets. Power now flows through refineries, not just mines. China dominates the midstream. It refines the bulk of lithium chemicals, processes most rare earths, and controls huge shares of cobalt and graphite flows. Such scale gives leverage. Export permits on gallium, germanium, and graphite showed how policy can weaponize choke points. The message landed in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and beyond. The United States changed the rules of access. The EV tax credit now links eligibility to where minerals are mined, refined, and recycled. Materials tied to foreign entities of concern risk disqualification. Automakers got limited breathing space, but the direction is clear: build allied supply chains or lose the check. This is industrial policy by stealth and by statute. It raises costs in the short run. It also pushes capital into new projects at home and with partners. Europe wrote its own playbook. The Critical Raw Materials Act sets targets for extraction, processing, and recycling inside the bloc by 2030. The aim is not autarky. It is risk control. Yet the gap between ambition and capacity is wide. Permitting is slow. New mines face local pushback. Europe will likely hit recycling targets first, with mining and refining lagging. That still helps. Secondary supply lowers import risk and reduces environmental harm per unit. Resource-rich nations see a window. Indonesia banned raw nickel ore exports and forced investment onshore. The result was a flood of smelters, rising exports of refined products, and a bigger voice in price formation. LME approval for Indonesian metal underlined that shift. But growth rode on coal-fired power and waste-heavy processing. Communities near plants carry that burden. The policy created jobs and value. It also created soot, tailings, and a reputational bill that global buyers now factor in. Congo holds most cobalt in the ground. The world asked it to power the energy transition. The reality on the ground is stark. Artisanal miners face danger and abuse. Enforcement waxes and wanes. Oversupply then crushed prices, prompting export stops and new rules. Some demand is shifting as battery makers cut cobalt content or switch chemistries. That eases pressure but does not solve governance or livelihoods. Without transparency and fair contracts, the resource curse repeats under a green label. The water story is just as hard. Brine extraction in Chile's Atacama fuels EVs and grid batteries. It also strains hydrology in a desert where water means life. New science links pumping to subsidence and ecosystem risk, though methods and baselines remain contested. Better metering, community oversight, and cleaner power for processing can lower impact. Direct lithium extraction may help, but it is not a silver bullet yet. Counter-arguments deserve airtime. One says market forces will fix this. Low prices today prove that supply responds fast. The rejoinder is timing. Projects take years. Demand for copper, lithium and rare earths rises for decades, not quarters. Another says recycling will save us. It will help a lot, and Europe is right to push it. But end-of-life volumes remain too small this decade to meet new demand. A third says substitution will cut risk. Chemistries like LFP and sodium ion do reduce cobalt and nickel needs. They also create new dependencies on graphite or hard-to-process elements. None of these levers alone closes the gap. Pull them together, and the risk falls to manageable levels. So why does this race matter? Because control over refining and rules now shapes who captures value, who breathes the fumes, and who sets standards for workers and water. How do we avoid a dirty green boom? By tying public money to measurable ESG outcomes, by enforcing contract transparency, by auditing supply chains beyond the first tier, and by giving affected communities a real seat at the table, not a checkbox. When do resource nations get a fair deal? When policy moves from exporting ore to exporting components, when training and power infrastructure arrive before the furnaces, and when price cycles do not dictate school budgets. At what cost? Less, if we plan for cumulative impacts, permit faster with stronger safeguards, and accept that resilience carries a premium the world must pay. You are watching a YouTube documentary analysis. If this helped, please subscribe for more deep dives on the political economy of the green transition. Answers to the opening questions: who really wins? Those who control refining, standards, and alliances, not just mines. Can a green future run on dirty mines? Not for long without backlash and bottlenecks, cleaner processes and real oversight at the price of scale. Will Washington or Beijing set the rules? Both will shape them, but coalitions and midstream choke points decide leverage. When do resource-rich nations cash in? When they move up the chain and lock in fair, transparent deals. At what cost? Lower than today if we invest in recycling, substitution, clean power, community consent, and enforceable ESG, and higher if we delay.